I'm walking down the high street in southwest London, in Wandsworth town, and I am on my way to quite a fancy gym.
Okay, strict press and wave loads. You can start off with 5 reps at 100% of your 10 rep max. Once you've done that, your partner will then do 100% of the 10 rep max. Okay, then you go down to 4 reps, 3 reps, 2 reps, and increase the weight as you go along. Okay, strict press, as you can see, the bar is going to come all the way down to his chest. Full range and all that power.
This is Military Fitness London, a personal training gym owned and run by Grant King. Grant is in his mid-30s. He's about 6 feet tall, athletic, and has perfect hair. But he's not supposed to be here. He's supposed to be in Qatar, where a few years ago he'd managed to build himself his dream life. Grant used to be a soldier.
The whole way through school, I kind of knew I was going to be in the army. Granddad was in the army, stayed in the army his whole life, loved the army. I looked up to my granddad as well, kind of saw him as a bit my idol.
He served on multiple tours in the British Army, including in Iraq and Afghanistan over 8 years. He'd seen and been through a lot. After leaving the army, he moved back home to Margate, the seaside town where he'd grown up. But there, he found it hard to slot back into life.
I just kind of felt so out of place, I didn't feel I belonged there anymore. So I wanted to do something different. I thought I'd take a year off.
That's when Grant moved to Qatar to become a personal trainer, and he absolutely loved it.
I was enjoying what I was doing, meeting new people, and getting kind of paid pretty well for it. So for me, for the first year out there, it was kind of like, and then the guys I was living with as well, it was a bit like a lad's holiday as such. It was a very different experience, and it's like the longer I was there, the more I knew I was definitely not going to rejoin the army.
And soon, he started doing pretty well there.
And the reason why I think we worked is because I really went down that military route. I wore them military trousers. I let everyone know I was ex-military. So when running boot camps, if you want to kind of come to a real boot camp, come to mine because I'm military and the other people aren't.
That's where he met Elena. They're married now. She's originally from Romania, but was working in Qatar as an air hostess for the royal family.
That was literally a dream job for me.
Why was it so good?
I had a wonderful accommodation, wonderful pay. Traveling was beautiful. I can't really complain. It was just, and lots of free time, lots of free. So I had a dream life.
Grant decided to start his own personal training business in Qatar.
After a year of being there, I decided I wanted to work for myself. Kind of like the idea of not as such being controlled by somebody, not being told what to do, where to be.
To do that in Qatar, he first had to partner with a local sponsor, sort of like Marek had to do in Nigeria from our last episode. And like Marek, Grant also had a major falling out with his business partner about the ways that the business should be run.
He was now refusing to call me, refusing to answer my messages, blocked me on WhatsApp, not answering my emails.
His business partner was from a powerful family in Qatar. So when things became hostile, Grant sought advice from a lawyer friend.
The lawyer said, leave the country if you can, leave it now, which I literally did. I drove home to Eleanor that day and I said, I'm getting a flight, and I booked a flight instantly to London. And I flew, which obviously was a huge shock.
I was crying. I was like, when am I going to see you again? And he was crying and it's like, what's happening to our lives?
All the way down, hold, slowly up. Good, and again. Good.
Since then, Grant hasn't left the UK at all, because after his return, he discovered that he was, in fact, on Interpol's red list.
We got the official letter when it was Grant King's name, Interpol list, and it kind of hit us. We were like, oh my God, this is happening? What does it mean?
I just felt there's nothing I could do.
Grant looks visibly angry as he tells me that this has not only cost him his business, but also his life savings. He didn't feel safe travelling with a red notice hanging over him, so he and Eleanor were separated for what they say felt like an eternity.
So I was all alone with no money. COVID was becoming a thing. It was just, really, really dark time. So even though I knew I'd done nothing wrong, I just felt like a criminal. I felt like I'm on the run. I felt like I'm one of the world's most wanted men.
Nearly 1 year later, Eleanor and Grant were eventually reunited in London. But the real work of trying to fight the Red Notice was only just starting.
We spoke to the British Embassy in Qatar. It was one of the first things we'd done. But I sent a very detailed situation of what happened. And they always said to me was, yeah, you probably will be on the Interpol list. Here's a list of lawyers that we recommend you use. And they said, so I sent back and said, oh, is there nothing that you can do? You can help? They said, this isn't what we do. We're only here for diplomatic reasons between UK and Qatar. So I completely shut out instantly by our British embassy. I contacted our local MP. They said, oh, this story does sound very bad. I'm going to put this forward and see what can be done about it. He eventually did come back and say, unfortunately, this is something that we just don't deal with.
We reached out to the UK Foreign Office, who said that they didn't receive a request for consular assistance in Grant's case. We also contacted his former business partner, who didn't respond. What I've heard from Grant is similar to what I've heard from several others, that when this happens to you, the process of trying to fight it can be overwhelming, even crushing, and it can take years to untangle yourself from the consequences. The whole experience has changed Grant.
Growing up, I was very British and proud. I wanted to serve this country. I wanted to be valued to this country. And then when it comes to when you actually need a bit of help from them, they do nothing for you. All I wanted was just someone just to write an email to them, to Qatar, to someone there, to their government to say what's going on. The more I kind of lost faith in our government, in our system and everything. Then COVID happened, and then all the answer I got from them was like, you're not my business. My business is to connect Qatar and UK as diplomatic ties or whatever their reason is. I wasn't good enough, me as a human being, as a person, as a living thing. I wasn't any value to them. I would never fight for this country again.
The person who helped Grant navigate Interpol was Radha Sterling, a UK-based advocate for Red Notice victims.
Said it was going to cost, I think it was £850 just to check. And I didn't have the money. This was a time where we had no money at all whatsoever. So there's no way we could afford to do it.
He was left with no choice but to borrow money from anyone he could so that he could pay Radha to help him out of his situation. It ended up being thousands of pounds.
Hi, Radha. Nice to meet you. Sahar, finally in person.
Hi, come on in.
Thank you.
I've come to meet Radha in her office in Windsor. She runs Detained in Dubai, a group which focuses on raising the profile of people who've been arrested across the Gulf. Her expertise with Red Notices was really just the byproduct of this, something she had to learn from scratch. And it shocked her.
I mean, to me, it was amazing that we had an unaccountable organisation that was able to issue notices that would affect people in other countries on behalf of countries that I knew were convicting people in absentia without evidence, without a trial, and that they had access to this approved organisation that had respect. You would never think that this organisation could possibly be involved in implementing abuse on behalf of these nations who we saw were violating human rights. So Interpol's their little bypass. It allows them to export their justice worldwide. So to me, that was the most appalling thing of all.
Radha says that fighting a red notice is like preparing submission for a court of law. It's a ton of paperwork and lots of back and forth. But in reality, Interpol isn't a court, and she isn't a lawyer. Technically, you don't have to be.
So I'm writing to Interpol on a very regular basis, and they're writing back quite respectfully. They are deleting the notices that are abusive, and they're explaining the reasons why they're doing that. But still, there's no push for change. There's no push to reduce the time frames as well. Who can wait that kind of time? They can't travel. They can't be reunited with their family. They lose their job. You know, a lot of the time, the Interpol notice is the punishment. It is the persecution. It's the method of state harassment.
You've got 15 seconds to pronounce. That's 10.
I mean, you've got tears in your eyes. You're clearly a very strong person, but this whole experience has clearly had a huge impact on your life.
It's like try everything we can. I don't know, even lawyers, they do nothing. We give them all the money we got, and we just get ignored. Right? And then I got ignored by lawyers in Qatar, Qatari lawyers, English lawyers. Now, we pay all the money we don't have. We had to remortgage our property that we had to pay for lawyers. And I'm still waiting. You know, we've been doing this for a year and a half. We started a year and a half ago fighting as an Interpol. We was told within 9 months, I'll be off Interpol. I'm still on it. Don't know an answer. I don't know when I'll know an answer. Ask people. They don't know. Ask lawyers that you paid. They don't know the answer. I'm trapped in a country I can't leave. I'm wasting money on people that can't help me.
I'm Sahar Zand, and this is Dirty Work, a podcast series from Sky News about the ways that Interpol's notice systems are vulnerable to abuse. Red notices are kind of like a digital wanted person poster sent out by countries to Interpol's network. And diffusions are essentially the same thing, except that they're sent out directly to specific countries. Both are meant to be used for catching fugitives. People wanted for what Interpol calls ordinary law crimes. Think murder, kidnapping, money laundering. But we've learned that the system can also be misused to catch a lot of other people too. Some political opponents of powerful regimes. Others, ordinary people who've simply lived, worked, or done business abroad in countries where the local police are corrupt or the court system are subject to influence. To understand how this happens, we have to look at how Interpol was built, and we need to get right down to its very foundation.
After World War I, the initial Interpol is established, and it's set up in Vienna, Austria.
This is Dr. Ted Bromund, a senior research fellow in Anglo-American relations at the Heritage Foundation, which is a Washington-based think tank. That doesn't really cover it, though. The reason you're hearing from him is that Ted is basically the go-to guy on anything relating to Interpol. It's one of his main research focuses, and he's served as an expert witness before parliaments around the world.
Thank you very much. I'm Ted Bromund. I'm a senior research fellow.
When we first started asking questions about Interpol abuse, whenever our sources were struggling with an answer, many of them would say, "Have you spoken to Ted?" I first met him at the House of Lords in London. He was on the panel at an event focusing on how China uses Interpol to pursue dissidents outside of its borders.
The People's Republic of China is the largest and most
Dr.
successful
Bromund
user
says that the
Interpol.
seeds of the issues with Interpol today were there from the very beginning, 100 years ago.
Almost immediately, difficulties begin to arise because one of the early members of Interpol is fascist Italy. And there are already questions about how much democratic nations should be cooperating with a fascist power through Interpol.
Interpol was a small and little used organization, which lay dormant in the years surrounding World War II.
And after World War II, for a long time, it remains a relatively sleepy organization, only really springing to life after 9/11.
The story of post-war Interpol can be told through two hijackings. The first in 1950.
A number of individuals in then Czechoslovakia hijack a plane and fly to freedom in the West after the Cold Wars began.
3 planes, actually. The hijackers were ex-pilots from the Czech Royal Air Force, and they flew themselves to a US Air Force base in West Germany where they claimed asylum.
Czechoslovakia is a member of Interpol and requests that the West act against these individuals and return them to Czechoslovakia. And this drives the United States to quit Interpol. It's so infuriated at the thought that Interpol would be used to send people back behind the Iron Curtain that J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI quits. Interpol then writes a new constitution, which makes it very clear that Interpol is not to be used to pursue political crimes. And so the whole story of Interpol, from fascist Italy before World War II to the new constitution in the early 1950s up to today, the problem that Interpol has always had is that it has these places like fascist Italy, like Czechoslovakia, like Russia today, that are not democracies that use Interpol to pursue people who have fled abroad, refugees and emigres. And again, Interpol has had to face this challenge, which it has found exceptionally hard to meet.
But up until the early 2000s, the tools available to countries seeking to capture fugitives were fairly limited.
It isn't really worth your while to harass someone through Interpol if every time you have to do it, you have to use an old-fashioned telex machine.
Red notices were still being sent around the world by third-class mail. But the hijackings of 9/11 2001 changed things. At the time of the attacks and during the war on terror, there was an American man at the helm of Interpol. His name is Ronald K. Noble, and at the time, he was the Secretary General. This is him in an interview with the Associated Press in the year 2004.
I believe intelligence gathering and intelligence sharing and then acting in a coordinated fashion is the future. And it's been demonstrated with September 11th, where there were suspected terrorists who had been stopped by a local police officer who checked the database and their names were not in it. So we have evidence connecting terrorists to ordinary crime, but we need the databases, the communication system, and police to have the will and courage to check Interpol's database.
Ron Noble made it his mission to revolutionize Interpol. In the same Associated Press interview, he says that if Interpol was a business, it would be a small cap with great growth potential. It's almost as though the head of Interpol had adopted the mantra of the dot-com startup era: move fast and break things.
But it was part of you could call it sort of a cowboy era of Interpol expansion. Lots of growth, lots of new ideas, some of them very good, some of them not so good. Lots of money being raised as fast as possible, not a lot of care being taken about what was happening to the system.
Noble was focused on getting as many police forces around the world as possible to use Interpol. Because in a way, a global system only works if everybody is using it. But to ensure that, he needed to revamp the way that notices were being shared. And that's when he created a system called I-24/7.
And Ron Noble does a lot of very good work in bringing Interpol's technology up to date. It essentially becomes a web-based system with a private communications network. All of that was good. The problem is that when Interpol set up that new system, it didn't realize that a simpler system would make abuse easier and much more effective.
These warnings, though, weren't just from the critics. Senior lawyers who worked for Interpol told Ron Noble that his new online system would, yes, make it much easier and faster to go after criminals, but that it would also make it much more straightforward for authoritarian states to use it to hunt down their dissidents.
He does not take those warnings at all seriously. He is in go, 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 empire building mode. Interpol is building a new headquarters in Singapore. It's building its new online communication system. It's starting project after project. Go, 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 go. Don't think about it very much. Well, then the abuse starts. And by that point, Noble is trapped. He knows that there is abuse in the system, but he's the one who built it. So all he can possibly do is to deny.
The new system came online in 2004. Police in most countries were now able to submit notices online and have them shared with the rest of the network pretty much immediately. But there were virtually no checks in place before they were published, and the system for hearing appeals to questionable notices was weak and ineffective. By 2006, in just the first 2 years of the new system, the number of red notices had more than doubled to around 2,800 a year. Obviously, not all or even most of these were abusive. But by making it easier to issue red notices, I-24/7 now required a whole new compliance system to monitor and prevent abuse.
All of these problems were utterly foreseeable, and I will just say that I wrote my first paper on the subject in 2012, and I at that point said that there will be a lot more of this happening because there is no effective defense against it, and it works. And I don't want to pat myself on the back too much, but I was right. And you know what? Because it was so obvious that this system was open to abuse, and once places like Russia figured that out, every other bad actor out there in the world was going to copy them. And that's precisely what they did.
Ron Noble left Interpol in 2014, after 14 years at the helm. He now runs a security consultancy based in Dubai. He hasn't commented publicly about his tenure at Interpol since his term ended. He didn't want to be interviewed, but by email he told us that his reforms were urgent and necessary because the early 2000s was a period of fighting global terrorism. He said Interpol was aware that a system involving so many countries had the potential for abuse, but that there was a process for checking red notices through Interpol's Office for Legal Affairs, and that there were rules in place against abusive red notices. He says he knows this because he was the one in charge when Bill Browder's red notices were cancelled. The Ron Noble era is one of the most significant in Interpol's history, as he oversaw a massive expansion of the modern red notice system. Today, there are some 20,000 red notices and diffusions issued each year. But it was Noble's successor who had to make his big ideas work. Jurgen is a German police officer and academic who's worked for Interpol since 2005. He's the current Secretary General, and his term in office will come to an end next year. I've come to see him in Lyon, France, at Interpol's headquarters. It's quite a dated office block. You can almost immediately tell that it was built in the 80s. It's a square building made of glass, with offices surrounding an atrium full of indoor plants. The 5 floors look down on the Interpol logo tiled into the floor. The whole building is also smaller than I was expecting.
Yeah, hold everything through. Then just please use your badge to hold there and then hold it.
Yep, that's the recorder going through the security scanner, along with everything else we had with us. I'm keen to find out what Jurgen makes of a system that's clearly flawed, and one that he's staked his legacy on fixing.
Hi, I'm Sahar. Nice to meet you.
Hello. Welcome. And as the globalization of crime is continuing, this mechanism that only Interpol can provide, it's a unique capability we are having, more important than ever.
Mr. Stark, can you explain why you put into place the so-called safeguard to improve the integrity of Interpol and its notice systems?
Yeah, first of all, because quality of information that is circulated through Interpol's channels is of utmost importance. A police officer at the street who is doing a check of a person, a border police officer, want to be sure that the information is safe, is sound, is reliable, is checked. And we implemented a number of measures to ensure that every single piece of information that goes through our channels, that is being used by member countries to inform each other, is compliant with our rules and regulations.
Stock's big innovation was creating something called NDTF, short for Notices and Diffusions Task Force. The purpose of this is to check red notices and diffusions before they're uploaded onto the system to make sure they're compliant.
Maybe 80-90% of all the requests are non-controversial, no problem, easy to decide quickly and to publish at the end of the day. We have a percentage of about roughly 5% of the notice where the Secretariat, the NDTF, concludes non-compliant. That might give you an idea about the ratio between, let's say, cases that are non-controversial, relatively easy to decide, and those.
According to Interpol's data, last year, this task force knocked back nearly 1,500 red notices and diffusions. The red notices before they were uploaded, but the diffusions go straight to the countries before they get checked. 300 of those they knocked back were specifically for abuse. But the available data is patchy. And importantly, it doesn't tell us how many were caught before a third country saw them and potentially arrested someone, which we know is enough to turn their lives upside down.
The number of cases where at a later stage we find out that there is non-compliance is very limited. I cannot tell you whether it's 10 or 20 or 5.
Why isn't that available?
But it's
because that would be very
small.
telling. Why isn't that number available?
I mean, we have been putting a lot of public information
but why not that?
on Interpol's website.
Why aren't you publishing that? Why aren't you saying how many of these notices are actually, wrong?
We are bringing a lot of information on the public website. We are not the owner of the information very often. It's information that is owned by member countries if it concerns an individual case. We are also respecting our member countries, and we are permanently looking into what else we can do to ensure transparency in the process.
So, we know that some cases still slip through the net. Stuck's other move was to professionalize and bolster the independence of a pre-existing body known as the CCF, short for Commission for the Control of Interpol Files. The CCF is the body you contact to find out if there is a notice out for you, and also the one you petition to if you believe it should be removed. The CCF deals with notices and diffusions already in the system. It's independent from the General Secretariat, so Jurgen Stuck wouldn't speak to us about it in detail, and the numbers aren't as up-to-date either.
Independent separate body within the Interpol system, but not under my command. If the CCF takes a decision, I have to follow the decision the CCF has been taken. If they decide, based on an appeal, that a notice needs to be deleted, I simply have to execute that. Before it was a kind of recommendation, now it's a binding decision that's been published.
In 2021, the most recent year for which we have data, 659 people contacted the CCF to complain about a red notice. Interpol only considers the ones they call admissible. This is where there definitely was a red notice or diffusion on file, and also where the person asking about it had formatted their request properly. There were 487 of those. In the same year, the CCF deleted 296 notices. But we don't know what years they were from. Stuck gave CCF deadlines and said that cases should be resolved within 9 months. But Interpol doesn't say whether that's being met or not. Still, Stuck is keen to stress that the two-part safety mechanism is mostly working as intended.
I mean, there's never a perfect system, perhaps, and you have to see that as a kind of shared responsibility. So first of all, there is a responsibility on the side of the member country that is requesting, for instance, a red notice. So we are assuming that this information is correct, but we are not taking it kind of blindly, no.
Based on the information you're telling me, what I'm hearing is that you think you have fixed that problem, that there was a lot of non-compliance.
I think we have to understand, I think we have been fixing those problems that existed originally, which created also a lot of legal risks for Interpol. So we have been doing everything we thought that needs to be done in accordance with international law standards to ensure, again, a 100% compliance mechanism.
You may have noticed from my conversation with Jurgen Stuck that when I talk about problems at Interpol or what he's done to address them, in his response, he focuses on compliance. He doesn't talk about what's appropriate or even what's fair, but only what's compliant.
That is our job according to the rules. A very comprehensive process, and at the end of the day, there is, because very often it only takes 1 day, but at the end there's a decision within 24 or 48 hours. Because sometimes, if a murderer is on the run, time matters. It's a time-sensitive thing. We cannot wait until let's wait a week or 2 weeks. The member country and maybe also the general public is expecting an answer quickly. Somebody can jump into a plane in a few hours. He or she is somebody else and committing the next crime. So we need to act fast. But again, quality is of the essence.
Sometimes, once these notices have been removed, revoked, cancelled, once they're reviewed in CCF, for many of the individuals who are subjected to abusive notices, it's simply too late. They've already been arrested. Sometimes they've already been extradited. They are in a position that's irreversible. Are you saying that in order to be able to get these notices out as soon as possible, it's acceptable to see individuals who are subjected to abusive notices as just merely collateral damage?
No, quality matters. And that's why I'm saying every non-compliant case we would have, every case where we would publish a non-compliant notice based on the information we are having at the time when it's been published would be one case too many.
You're going to hear more of my sit-down interview with Jurgen Stuck in the next episode, especially about consequences for the countries abusing the system. But in terms of the changes we've talked about here, most people accept that Jurgen Stuck has made improvements, even Interpol's long-time critics.
I think Stuck, who I obviously have some differences with, has done a reasonably good job of trying to clean up some of the mess that he inherited from the Ron Noble era.
But the NDTF isn't catching everything, and the CCF is opaque and unaccountable. You can't appeal their decisions, and Interpol has legal immunity in almost every jurisdiction. There is no other place you can turn to.
One of the most difficult things with clients is to try and explain to them that It's not about guilt or innocence. It's not about trying to prove that they're innocent, because that's an almost impossible task to do.
And the Commission for Control of Files expressly will not make a finding as to whether or not someone is guilty of the underlying offence. It doesn't matter.
So we've had clients turn up to this room with piles of files and say, no, but I've got all this evidence to show that it's all rubbish. They've made it all up. And you're like, well, but I can't put a suitcase full of documents, send them into Interpol and say, well, my client's innocent.
Ben Keith and Rhys Davies are two British lawyers who specialise in Interpol cases.
What do we say we are? It's Lauren Hardy.
Lauren Hardy.
Though they don't work in the same chamber, they do work together often.
Twice last week, his was the first voice I heard when I woke up. It was like the phone rang. I said before I spoke to my wife.
Probably being a different time zone.
Yeah.
Anyway, let
you hang up.
They also run the Red Notice Monitor, a website dedicated to news about Interpol and its notice system. Ben and Rhys are incredibly experienced when it comes to the ins and outs of Interpol appeals, and particularly in dealing with the CCF.
It's difficult, it takes time, it's imperfect, you've got to get lawyers.
I mean, it's got a 9-month backlog.
Yeah, exactly.
So if we submitted a Red Notice removal request tomorrow, Interpol's current timescale to let you know that whether there's a Red Notice on the system or not is 4 months, and for them to get a meeting where they consider whether or not to remove it is 9 months.
And you have to request it. They won't just normally do that.
The only cases where they will remove it without you having to request are ones they wouldn't issue in the first place, or if you raise it with them and say, "Hang on, I'm the Prime Minister of this country, and therefore."
Those super high-profile ones. Back to the kind of Bill Browder example.
I mean, the CCF themselves, I think, are pretty competent. They do a good
Very
job.
good lawyers.
They're very good lawyers. Do a good job. But there's 7 of them. 7 or 9.
Yeah.
And they meet every 2 to 3 months.
Yeah.
For a few days. So
and the submissions they get, whilst they're short, they will have large appendices attached to them. So there's a lot of information they've got to get through.
The role of the CCF is not to be a global court. They're not looking into whether or not allegations made against a person are just or fair. They have no jurisdiction to do that, and they wouldn't have time or capacity anyway. They're only checking whether or not the information that their requesting country has sent Interpol about a wanted person complies with its own rules. But even that can be difficult.
In some ways, it is difficult to have sufficient oversight in certain cases. I'm thinking of Chinese cases. A lot of Chinese use of the Red Notice system, what they do is they cloak political allegations in in ordinary law criminality. So they have to be ordinary law crimes. And again, it comes back to these cases of corruption and fraud and things of that nature, is that they have what are subtly but importantly still political campaigns to target individuals who they just want to get at for whatever political reason. But they will say you are corrupt, and it is very difficult.
It's very sophisticated.
Yeah, it is very sophisticated, yeah.
It's almost an impossible task to examine very specific and often intricate international legal disputes in close to real time, especially when countries have adapted to Interpol's compliance mechanisms.
So we're left with the sense that, according to Interpol, about 5% of red notices have been found by them to be abusive. But you know what I say to that? If you see a cockroach on the floor of your kitchen and you stamp on it, what are the odds that there are no more cockroaches under the fridge, behind the range, or in the walls? When there's one, there's going to be more. So my feeling is that 5% is the floor on the number of cockroaches, and the real answer is probably a good deal higher than that.
John Glendinning is leading a protest at Holyrood, outside the Scottish Parliament building in Edinburgh, trying to raise awareness of his brother Brian's case.
Feeling very good about the turnout, really good and positive. Again, I'll say that a lot of people have had to take time off for their work today, loss of earnings just to turn up for Brian to show support, so that will never be forgotten.
Why do you think they care so much?
I think they care so much because, one, they know Brian, they know who he is, they've got that connection with Brian, but I also think they actually care about the actual situation that's happening to Brian, and it happens to others. It's happened in the past, it will happen again, it will continue to happen. There's lots of people in Brian's situation, not just UK nationalists, there's European, American, Lebanese that are next to Brian at the moment.
Brian has now been in an Iraqi prison for 6 weeks in grim and even dangerous conditions after being arrested on a red notice. Qatar is looking for Brian after he failed to appear at a court date over about £4,000 remaining on his loan to the bank there. His family have no idea what to do to get Brian out. So like Grand King, the Glendennings have also teamed up with Radha Sterling. After the protest, the family head back to Brian's mum's house.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Radha.
Radha has called with an update.
As you know, we've been negotiating with the Qatar National Bank, and they've agreed to propose that they are going to, essentially, if we pay them £32,000, they are willing to withdraw the extradition case. They're willing to...
The bank says they're willing to settle for about 10 times the outstanding debt. It's a lot of money. Radha says that this is a very unusual situation. They're speaking in October 2022, just before the World Cup in Qatar. Radha thinks that maybe the country is trying to avoid bad press, which from her experience often helps move things along.
Usually in these situations, it's going to be, 2 to 4 months to get something like this resolved. But they are willing to...
The bank is suggesting that Brian's criminal case could be dropped within 24 hours of the payment.
And what's your thoughts on how quick, on a really everything running smoothly? I know that we're going to have bumps in the road, but let's just have a wee bit of positivity on the great news that you've said. What's your thoughts on that?
Okay, so if everything goes smoothly, and assuming it does, we would need to send the funds to them within 24 hours, and they have promised within another 24 hours to remove the criminal case against Brian.
So Radha, are we gambling?
Yes. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that we're gambling. Yes, there is a risk that they would turn around once we pay that amount, that they would turn around and they would say, you know what, screw you, we're not going to do anything serious.
The family feel like they're being shaken down, that Qatar is using Interpol as a vehicle for debt collection. But still, with Brian trapped in prison in Iraq and increasingly desperate, they all agree that the deal is the best chance they've got.
That absolutely terrorises me. The thought of, there's no 100% guarantee this is going to come off.
I do want to leave you with some good news. There has been an update on Grant and Elena.
Hi, Sahar. Grant here on the 16th of May, nearly 6 p.m. I've just spoken to Radha, which she just basically said that she now has confirmation from Interpol that they have actually now deleted my name. So that's obviously a huge weight off my shoulders. But the strange thing for me is that obviously when she told me, it was kind of like, I don't know, I thought I was going to be a lot more excited. I thought I was going to be a lot more happy about it. And so it's weird because as much as I've been waiting for this day for such a long time, I still feel cheated. I still feel like 2 years of my life has been financially impacted, mental health impacted, lots family impacted. And I still feel like this 2 years of my life has just been a huge setback, and obviously that I'm not going to get back. It's been extremely unfair throughout. Straight away, my next thoughts is I want to do something about this. I want somehow to take this further. I don't know how to take it further. I don't know what to do to take it further. But why is it taking nearly 2 years for Interpol to realise there's no evidence? How have they put my name on there in the first place with no evidence? It's a strange feeling, like victory day, but without feeling victory.
Qatar didn't respond to the CCF when Interpol requested they clarify Grant's red notice. They didn't get back to our request for comment either. In this episode, you've heard from Jurgen about the changes he's implemented to prevent abuse of Interpol's red notice system. But are those changes working? Next time, you'll hear from 2 people who've been the subject of politically motivated red notices from countries with a poor track record on human rights. One was arrested 2 years ago and has been in prison ever since. The other was actually extradited and flown on a private plane back to a country that had stripped him of his citizenship. In both cases, Interpol has acknowledged that the notices should have never been issued. Since the broadcast of our first episode last week, we've been contacted by a number of people from around the world who've been impacted by wrongful Interpol notices. We will get back to you. And if you or someone you know is in the same boat and wants to share their story, please send us an email to skynewspodcasts@sky.uk. Or if it's easier, find me on social media. I'm at Sahar Zand on Twitter. Finally, if you're worried that there could be an Interpol notice out for you and are keen to check with the CCF, it's actually free to do so. And you don't always need a lawyer either. Just go to www.interpol.int for more information.